Stole my joke.
Well, you didn't make it. Come on, man. Pick up your cues.
I felt like it was wrong to reuse the joke.
Daniel, what are we doing here?
Yeah.
What is this dance we do every week?
Yeah.
This is ridiculous.
I'm just a real, I'm like one of those like very prima donna-ish performers that's all about spontaneity.
Why are we working together then?
Well, exactly. You need that, the dynamic.
Well, I will happily take the scraps of whatever jokes you f***ed up the first time. I will pass them as well. You're the one who didn't press record.
Oh, right.
Welcome to Save Me From My Shelf, a literature podcast where we take classic tomes off their pedestal to make you less anxious about reading them. Our jokes come from a place of love and for a specific teaching purpose. However, if you think that making fun of great literature, and maybe some mild swearing, is offensive, this might not be the podcast for you. Hello, you are listening to Save Me From My Shelf, and hello, governor, over here is Daniel.
Howdy, partner. Partner? Is Abby?
You might notice that we have a new sound. We finally upgraded our swiftly deteriorating microphones. Hopefully this pleases all the audiophiles out there who are like, you guys sound shit.
All these people have us on vinyl.
So we're also back to our normal episode style after the time before's two-parter Canterbury Tales episodes. So it's also just the two of us again this week. No Justine this time. She's exhausted after leading the Pedants Revolt. So
very good.
That's my prefab on Justine. This is also a note to remind you that Aston University, where Daniel and I work, is starting up an MA English program, which is particularly useful for teachers of English. So if you are a teacher in the Midlands area and you would like Daniel and I to teach you, then please do apply for our Masters in English program. We also we've gotten a lot of letters and recommendations into our email and on Twitter. We're only going to read maybe one or two of these per episode, so if you have written in, don't worry, hang tight, we will get to you eventually. It might just be several episodes down the line. Would you like to read some of these letters, Daniel?
Yeah, I will. We've got one from another repeat offender. Aisha. Hi, Abby and Daniel. I hope you're both well. Now, I'm just going to already diverge from the letter. After that Inspector Calls ones, we're getting a few pushbacks now, aren't we? Which I think is good.
Yes, yeah, no, we actually do like it when people engage with us on text. If you think we've missed something or got something wrong, write us in nicely.
Yeah, well, this is one of those pushbacks. I've listened to your latest episode, which is what was
Turn of the Screw.
Thank you for covering this text. I teach it at A-level and will be setting it for students to listen to. Now, here comes the rebuke. I would add that the empire and imperialism is also a spectre that haunts this text, and much of Gothic 19th century literature in general, and was surprised that the death of the children's parents in India and Bly Manor being built on imperial wealth wasn't unpacked more, or indeed at all. Yeah, this was something I covered in a postcolonial reading with my students. Thanks, as ever, for the continuing helpful content. Best wishes, Aisha.
I think this is actually a really important email because, first of all, Aisha, you're absolutely right that that's a huge element of the text, and we didn't end up covering it in the episode. And I thought this might be a good time to sort of maybe let our listeners know how we make episodes. So Daniel and I did actually talk a bit about empire. Daniel talked about the Sea of Azov and things that's referenced in the book. So
the Crimean War stuff.
So we did talk a little bit about it. Even though these episodes are only an hour long, we actually record for probably 3 to 4 hours and then condense everything. So not everything makes it into every episode, and our sort of rule of thumb is if we can't say something that's either funny or in a way that's really pithy and analytical, it tends to end up on the editing room floor. It's just sort of the best of version. You'd think these episodes, how much worse can they get? Yeah. So there is a lot that we do cover in recording and then just doesn't ultimately make it in. But also there's a lot of stuff that we miss, and I think that's really important to acknowledge, that our episodes are not the definitive guide.
Oh no.
Just because we didn't address something, doesn't mean it doesn't exist. We're only two readers, and there are thousands of potential readings
Yeah.
for any particular text. And
Empire's always there, isn't it?
Aisha, I hope that today's episode, with its overt empire discourse, makes up for that slightly. And we're gonna review one other email because I think it's burning a bit of a hole in our pockets here, so to speak. Dear podcasts, not sure if that's podcasters you were meant to say.
Or just podcast.
I am writing to correct Daniel's typically slapdash approach to the physical sciences. You have our attention, sir. In the Inspector Calls episode, Daniel claimed that the light of stars had gone out long ago due to relativity. In reality, it's simply due to the finite speed of light, meaning that there can be a significant delay in the arrival time of light due to the vast intergalactic distances involved. Although the constancy of the vacuum speed of light, regardless of the speed of the emitting object, is one of the two foundational postulates that Einstein used to formulate the special theory of relativity, it is not relevant to the phenomenon at hand.
No, so I was close.
Secondly, Daniel claimed that relativity came out in 1912. Alas, no. Einstein published his special theory of relativity in 1905 and the general theory of relativity in 1915. My best regards, Jonathan. So, Daniel does tell me that he knows you in real life.
Yeah, let me just say that I used to live with this person.
Okay.
And he hasn't changed.
And I do want to say that, first of all, sir, you are lucky Daniel told me you're his friend, because I was about to go off on one about how no one can be mean to Daniel but me. Anyone else who tries to be mean to Daniel, I'm going to spike you like an American football, and then I'm going to spike Daniel too, because I'm going to do it anyway.
Yeah.
Secondly, look, we do always value correction, but you should note that we on this podcast, we simply don't care for science. If rays of light would like to refract or travel or get different, that is just none of our business.
No, yeah, you're right.
So Daniel, what is our text today? Don't shuffle that shit. We got good mics now. God damn it.
I need to...
How long is that thing?
It's not that long.
Okay. So Daniel, what is our text today?
We've passed through an age in which villain origin stories have been very popular. Maleficent, the bad fairy from Cinderella.
Nope. Sleeping Beauty.
Cool. Maleficent, the bad fairy from Sleeping Beauty, got her own film in 2014. So did would-be dog slaughterer Cruella de Vil in 2021.
Those Dalmatians killed her mother.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, we learned that. Nurse Ratched also from One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest. She got her own TV show. Don't know if people remember that. All of these narratives, they sort of offer a kind of revisionist, humanising perspective on characters who are otherwise one-dimensional and, it should be added, misogynist archetypes. Now, there may be some cynics out there who consider these villain origin narratives to be lazy attempts on the part of film and TV to remonetize pre-existing intellectual property while piggybacking on a movement that repudiates the sexism that these same industries help to propagate. While I have to say to you, cynics, it's time for a revisionist understanding of the villain origin story. We need an origin story for the villain origin story. And I think we might find it by reading today's text. Jean Rhys's Wide Sargasso Sea, written in 1966.
Can I immediately shoot this down?
Go on.
You're forgetting about Paradise Lost.
Nah, this is fine. Because this is also the feminist part.
Okay. So it goes without saying that we are going to spoil this text for you. Just a heads up about what we're going to be talking about. There's a lot of gaslighting, rape and sexual abuse, racism, imperialism, arson, ableism, slavery. Would you like to do some background, please?
Boy, would I. Would I? Jean Rhys, born 1890, was a novelist from Dominica. Rhys's family were both British and Creole, so kind of long-term white islanders. And she was, unsurprisingly therefore, perhaps from a fairly genteel background. So her family had a plantation and she went to boarding school in England. She had a kind of bohemian life in Europe. She tried to become an actress but didn't succeed. And in the sort of 20s and 30s, she was all, having all these affairs and marriages and was...
The 20s sound great for that. Just everyone fucking everyone else.
Well, exactly, yeah. It's just like part of the course, isn't it? It's not like it's hardly bohemian, is it? It's pretty conventional, I would say. She started a literary career after becoming the protege and lover of the British modernist novelist Ford Madox Ford. And I'm just going to say my Ford Madox Ford factoid that he described himself as a grey orc, which is, of all the flightless birds, is the least sexy, I think. So, Over these years, the 20s and 30s, Rhys made a name for herself as an author. She wrote Quartet, which is based on the affair of Ford. There's a film of it, isn't there? She wrote Good Morning Midnight, which is a sort of fragmentary stream of consciousness work. Yeah, a modernist fragmentary stream of consciousness work. Who thought of it? After this first phase, Rhys became a kind of recluse. She lived in Devon and Cornwall.
Do you have any jokes that you want to make here? Or?
No, not really.
Devon and Cornwall?
I know,
Isn't that a little...
Well,
pick a side, bitch.
Exactly, yeah, you're right, yeah. But then this text is all about ambiguous placings, isn't it? So,
okay, so that would make sense, yeah.
The Cornish Devonian deconstruction literary tradition. She ultimately wrote Wide Sargasso Sea, which was published in 1966 and had a bit of a kind of career renaissance, but then died in 1979. So Rhys's early works were very strongly influenced by modernism. As we'll see, Wide Sargasso Sea also employs a lot of modernistic devices, so omission, multiple perspectives, defamiliarization.
A lot of people say that this is sort of the last modernist novel written way after this period ended. Yeah.
It's a prequel to Charlotte Bronte's Jane Eyre, 1847, which we've also covered in this podcast, and is therefore, it's also kind of, playing on ideas of intertextuality and revisionism. It's kind of, these are all kind of classic postmodern themes, aren't they? So we've already done one of these kind of these bridge texts between periods with Lolita, haven't we? Which also is a kind of modernist, postmodernist sort of halfway house. So the novel is about Mr. Rochester and his marriage to his first wife, Bertha Mason, as we'll find out. She was like, a monster in Jane Eyre. Wide Sargasso Sea, like its predecessor, is a feminist novel, but I think you would agree, in a very different way to Jane Eyre, which we'll probably explore down the line. It's also a post-colonial text, as I was alluding to earlier. So it's about imperialism, the world economy, all of that, brought into focus, and it explores themes like slavery and race and, unequal cultural and economic relationships. And also, it deconstructs the perspective of, core and periphery.
With England as this exotic sort of
exactly,
locale.
Yeah. The Caribbean is the
norm.
The norm, and, the metropole, England and Europe, are the exotic thing.
Yeah, so I would really advise, just for context, if you haven't gone and listened to our Jane Eyre episode, which is, I believe, episode 15, I would really advise that you go and listen to that one first, because this one is it's a rewriting of Jane Eyre, or a prequel to it. Part 1. We open on a famous opening line. Quote, "They say when trouble comes, close ranks, and so the white people did, but we were not in their ranks."
So, already we've got these kind of themes of folk knowledge, history, race, exclusion, hierarchy, we're in post-colonial country.
Yeah. So it's the 1830s, and things are not going so great for the family of our narrator, Antoinette. She opens talking about her mother, who was a woman from Martinique, so she never quite fit in with the ladies of Jamaican society, and that's where the text is set, in Jamaica. And Antoinette's father died, leaving her mother this young, hot widow. She is this sort of stupid, beautiful woman who was once really wealthy, but now is like fallen into sort of poverty. So she kind of got the aura of a dying mall. The biggest issue is that the Emancipation Act of 1833 freed all of their slaves, but the government failed to recompense them. So now the family, the Causeways, that's their last name, they live this crappy life in this rundown house. And look, I hesitate to sound like an infomercial, but just their whole way of life, there's just got to be a better way. Mm-hmm. And the worst of these indignities, our narrator tells us, is that Black people now laugh at them in the street. And my prefab here is, well, you should expect to get laughed at if you're a fucking clown.
Yeah. Unfortunately, our narrator, Antoinette, her mother is still young and hot. And she doesn't understand why someone so young and so hot should have to suffer.
Same, really.
Yes, me too. Now we're marooned. She says, doesn't she, the mother, which I thought was interesting, because that's the Maroons were the freedom, seeking slaves, weren't they? That escaped into the jungle.
And it's evoking not only sort of marooned on an island, but also octoroon, quadroon.
You're both deserted, and also it's about black freedom.
But regardless, marooned. I'm like, calm down, Robinson Crusoe. You're white and you have nice tits. You'll be fine.
Things get worse when Antoinette's baby brother, Pierre, struggles to walk and talk. Their mother has a doctor come. He gives a sort of disability diagnosis, one of those kind of very broad, sweet ones they had back then. And the mother is never quite the same after that. She just spends all day walking up and down the veranda, because there's always a veranda, isn't there, in these sorts of things, while Antoinette runs wild in the garden and hangs out with her black nurse, Christophine, who was her mother's wedding present.
Wedding registry. So I would like a set of fine china, a blender, a new bath mat, and one human soul.
Yeah. Christophine, she never left after she was freed, and the mother says that they would have died if she had. But then again, maybe it would have been better if they'd all died. Maybe this is Christophine's last revenge, who knows?
Well, the mother says that. She says, like, it'd be better if she had left and we'd all just died.
Yeah. So I've put a lot of quotes in here. I probably won't read all of them, but I think this is a good one just to get a sense of the style. Our garden was large and beautiful as that garden in the Bible.
There's lots of Bible imagery in this, by the way. This is just the first.
The tree of life grew there, but it had gone wild. The paths were overgrown, and a smell of dead flowers mixed with the fresh living smell. Underneath the tree ferns, tall as forest tree ferns, the light was green. Ooh. Orchids flourished out of reach, or for some reason not to be touched. One was snaky looking, another like an octopus with long, thin, brown tentacles, bare of leaves, hanging from a twisted root. Twice a year the octopus orchid flowered. Then not an inch of tentacles showed. The scent was very sweet and strong. I never went near it. All the Culebri estate, that's where they live, isn't it, had gone wild like the garden, gone to bush. No more slavery. Why should anybody work? This never saddened me. Did not remember the place when it was prosperous. So obviously there's loads going on there about like life and death and everything kind of all intertwangling. Also I was thinking orchids, that's balls, isn't it? That's like literally, I don't want to keep going back to testicles, but...
I mean, you're preoccupied, but follow your bliss, my dude.
But that idea of the balls is something that you can't touch or something threatening or whatever forbidden about. But finally the bloke's the forbidden fruit, that's nice.
But yeah, that idea as well of the sort of the fecundity of this place. I mean, I think that wonderful bit, the dead flowers mixing with the fresh living smell, and the light was green.
Yeah, there's loads of that weird colour imagery.
I gotta be honest, I think this bitch is just trying to sell us a timeshare, and I'm tempted.
The next thing I was going to say is it's kind of like Southern Gothic, isn't it? But obviously... I mean, you could kind of call the South an extension of the Caribbean, or vice versa, maybe, but...
I mean, New Orleans is the obvious crossing point. There were places in Florida. Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, I got a real, like, Shirley Jackson vibe from this, but if Shirley Jackson maybe was gargling with racist marbles a little bit...
The Lottery. Is that Shirley Jackson?
Yes, okay. and many, many other works. Okay. But it's hard for this to not be a Gothic text, considering Jane Eyre is an incredibly Gothic text. So, one day, Antoinette is followed by a young black girl who calls Antoinette a, quote, white cockroach. And she says that no one wants their family around there, which depresses Antoinette. I'm sorry you're no longer invited to the party when you don't own all the guests. I mean, look, I know narratively our sympathies are supposed to be with Antoinette in this book, but to be honest, all the black people she encounters are kind of well within their rights to light her candy ass up. But Antoinette soon makes a friend, and that's another young black girl named Tia, who she plays with, and all goes really well between them until they decide to go swimming one day. And they make a bet, as kids do, because I think I've made this exact same bet in my childhood, on if Antoinette can do a somersault underwater. Antoinette does, but Tia says no she didn't, and then when Antoinette's in the pool, Tia steals the money that they bet, and she steals Antoinette's dress that she took off when they went swimming, leaving Antoinette with Tia's old rag to wear. So she has to go home in that, where, horror of horrors, her mother has all these important guests waiting. And this is like whatever the opposite of a glow-up is. I don't know slang, but that, the opposite of that.
Dim down?
And Christophine hates all of these new people that Antoinette's mother has started getting really buddy-buddy with because they're English colonizers and they use their deeply unfair laws to keep slavery going in spirit, if not necessarily in name.
No more slavery, she had to laugh. These new ones have letter of the law, same thing. They got magistrate, they got fine, they got jailhouse and chain gang, they got tread machine to mash up people's feet. New ones worse than the old ones. More cunning, that's all. Also, yeah, colonizer, I thought that seemed like a slightly odd way of putting it, but I mean, you're obviously right, but it feels a bit different because like the Creoles and the Africans have already colonized the Caribbean in the sort of, to all intents and purposes. These are like sort of like profiteers, aren't they? They're like coming to like capitalize on them.
But surely there are so many different ways to colonize.
Of course, yeah. No, you could. What they're doing is colonialism, but I feel it seems weird to call them colonizers because I imagine like people in black hats and kind of homesteading and stuff, and they're not doing that, are they? They're just buying up land, and it's more of a kind of
tomato.
Well,
Tobago.
no. I mean, you're right that the power thing is the same, but it's also clearly not the same because we've got Antoinette here too in the middle, the squeezed middle. Poor Lord love him.
But I think, but that's an interesting point, is that we're in a different phase of colonialism.
Yeah. Oh, no, definitely. That's true. Yeah, Antoinette represents the old order, and then these lot are the kind of new capitalistic types. There's also, I like all this kind of ambiguous stuff about, Antoinette says a lot of stuff about, like, real white people versus poor whites. So she kind of contrasts herself to that, which, that's a kind of key dynamic in the Caribbean, isn't it? I think that, or at least in this period, where you have, like, I was just thinking the example from Haiti, or before Haiti got independent, with the Grand Blanc, the Petit Blanc, the Jean de Couleur, and the Nègre. So you've just got all these kind of crazy categories that are all like, it's the confusion therein that's meant to create these power relations, or make them more ambiguous in a way that benefits the whites, or the rich whites.
Well, yeah, and I think that's an important distinction, is that the idea of whiteness over time has not always meant the same thing. So now we view, like, do you walk through the world as a person with white skin? But in previous times, Italian people, especially Irish people, Slavic people, they were not considered white.
And like Creoles here. Creoles are white on the island, but they're not white to British people.
Yeah,
I suppose that is interesting. Antoinette's mother takes up with these people, these, colonists, and starts, going out to parties with them, leaving her kids alone.
I'm sorry, but there is no way they are not dropping keys in a bowl at these parties.
Yep. And soon enough, her mother marries someone called Mr. Mason.
New daddy just dropped.
Young Antoinette, we learn that her mother is also named Antoinette, overhears people gossiping. Why would this rich coloniser, who could have his pick of any heiress in Jamaica or even England, pick a widow with no money, one child, Pierre, who's an, quote, idiot, and another, Antoinette, who's so angry and isolated that she's probably going the same way? Well, they conclude, this widow, I suppose she is a babe. So, that's all right then, I suppose. So let's all remember that a lot of the kind of ableism that surrounded Bertha Mason and Jane Eyre was also tied up with racial and sexual stuff. So that's, Rhys is playing with that same theme, isn't she, here?
Yeah, and I mean, just to avoid confusion, it's going to be made apparent later, but Bertha Mason in Jane Eyre is Antoinette Causeway. In this book, it's young Antoinette, our narrator. So just in case you're like, wait, I thought her name was Antoinette, why are we calling her Bertha, what's going on? That's what's happening here. So Mr. Mason, the new stepfather, he's a nice enough guy, but he just doesn't quite get white Caribbean people, and he even makes them eat boring English food.
Beef and mutton, pies and puddings. Oh, imagine that in really hot weather. I mean, it's bad enough when it's cold, but imagine that.
But that said, he has money, he fixes up their home, he's really into his hot young wife, and things generally start to look up for the family. Antoinette, our young narrator, takes to calling him White Pappy, which I thought was hilarious. And then, after about a year, for whatever reason, I don't think it's ever really fully said, both Antoinette and her mother, they start getting really anxious. And they're like, you know what, I think it's time to leave the estate. Can we please go someplace else? Antoinette even has a weird sort of vision about a rooster getting slaughtered, and I'm going to throw in a find the phallus here for no reason. Her mother wants to go anywhere else, even to visit Richard, Mr. Mason's son from his first marriage. And this is actually the guy who turns up in Jane Eyre when Bertha stabs his ass and bites him on the arm. Mr. Mason laughs it all off, and he's like, nothing's gonna happen. You women folk are all being paranoid. You've been living here for 5 years since the slaves were freed. Nothing bad has happened since. So why would we get attacked now? Quote, they're too damn lazy to be dangerous.
Come on, you gotta do James Mason. Yeah, they are too damn lazy to be dangerous.
It's just how they do. The mother, a noted white woman, is like, you just don't understand black people, James Mason.
One day she wakes up Antoinette out of a sound sleep because the local black people, you know them, they've surrounded the house.
Oh, somebody's about to get cancelled.
Yes, yeah. So Mr. Mason thinks it's just some drunken party that's got out of control, and the worst he predicts is that they'll all have hangovers the next day. So while the Mason family is all distracted, the mob sets fire to the house. Baby Pierre, little baby Pierre, he's asleep in the back. So the mother rushes in and rescues him, burning her hands badly in the process. But Pierre isn't responding. Is he alive or is he dead?
Ooh, things get a little spicy. So the house goes up in flames. The mother wants to rush back in, she's saved Pierre. We don't know if he's alive or dead. She's like, oh my god, I have to save my caged parrot. And the caged parrot can only say, who is there in French, qui est là. Is that a Rochester at the end of Jane Eyre allusion? Isn't the bit where he's blinded and Jane comes back and isn't he like, who is there?
I thought it was Adela.
Oh, does it? And Adele, speaks French as well.
Yeah. So
Okay, well, the blanket Jane Eyre, maybe.
Reading.
Yeah, reading here. We're going to put in a little klaxon for that.
Yeah.
Jane!
But Mr. Mason restrains the mother from trying to save the parrot. And in this really horrible scene, the parrot somehow manages to escape its cage in the house and makes its way up onto the burning roof. I mean, maybe you might remember a similar scene in Jane Eyre with another metaphorical caged exotic bird up on a burning roof.
Give me foreshadowing horn and the Jane klaxon.
Ooh, that's messy. I like it.
Jane!
But the Englishman, Mr. Mason, had previously clipped the parrot's wings, so...
Correct.
Yeah, heavy-handed metaphor alert.
Yeah, heavy wings.
So the parrot can't fly, and this poor flightless bird jumps off the roof to its death.
Could be a great orc. Could be about Ford Maddox Ford.
I was trying to remember. I was like, shit, what was it? Well, it's not a cassowary. What was the thing you were saying? I couldn't remember it. So I'm sure that Mr. Mason is having an extremely Job Bluth, I've made a huge mistake moment right about now. So there's this really tense standoff down below where it looks like the whole Mason family is about to be murdered, and finally the family is allowed to leave in a carriage. But before they do, Antoinette's friend Tia turns up in the crowd and she throws a jagged stone at Antoinette's head.
Oh.
Quote, I did not feel it either, only something wet running down my face. I looked at her and I saw her face crumple up as she began to cry. We stared at each other, blood on my face, tears on hers. It was as if I saw myself, like looking in a glass. I don't quite know why, but I'm going to pull out a queer reading here
God.
as fast as if it were like a standoff at a high noon.
I was going to say, you queer reading from the hip, you do, don't you?
You don't love it?
No, you're going to be really
Pew pew!
No.
First of all, give me my queer reading.
Yeah, okay.
I'm owed, it's my due and my tithe, and you've signed up for this.
Yeah, I know.
Secondly, why is it bad that I do queer reading from the hip? Why is that a bad thing? Like I'm in a Western.
Because shooting from the hip is not always accurate, is it? That's the point. That's what's wrong with shooting from the hip. And
I don't give a shit. Scatter.
Okay.
I will blast you
Right.
with
Just get a big blunderbuss and fill it with queer pellets and just shoot it at everyone. Yeah,
That's the dream. You've
Yeah.
just described my ideal reading situation.
Queer pellets. So, that's good. We cut to Antoinette waking up in her aunt's house after 6 weeks of fever. Poor baby Pierre is dead, and their mother is taking a rest cure. They had to give Antoinette a bad haircut because of the fever. The only cure for this is a bad haircut. Good news, however, the cut on her forehead won't leave a scar, so she can just get over this whole event. That's how it works, isn't it?
Yeah, Antoinette's like, hold on, just give me a moment to repress this. There we go.
The aunt, that is aunt, is super optimistic that white supremacy will rule the day.
I'm sorry, a white person said that? That just doesn't track. Antoinette's mother, she's had a proper mental breakdown, so Antoinette gets sent to a convent for her schooling. I mean, maybe they can teach her math or something.
Or physics. Eh?
Maybe this will be a Sister Act 2 Back in the Habit situation.
Where I become a nun and learn physics. Is that what you're saying?
Sister Act 2 is about when they take in, like, students to teach.
Oh, okay, cool.
You're not like a Vegas or
I'm not
Reno
involved.
singer.
It's not about me.
You're not involved at all.
It's not about me.
Do you know how much money I would pay to see a remake of Sister Act with you in the Whoopi Goldberg part?
I wouldn't mind doing a whole
Her
career.
whole back catalog.
All over.
You'd be great in Ghost.
Yeah. Pretty weird in The Colour Purple, I think. That we have quite a mistaken casting choice. Even you wouldn't go that far in your casting section.
So on her walk to the convent one day, Antoinette is followed by this mean black girl and this ugly, cruel black boy who Antoinette finds repulsive because while he's clearly black, he has white skin, freckles, and red hair. Yeah, Antoinette, I'd agree with you that evidence of years of colonialist rape is horrific. So this is just a really typical, like, childhood bullying thing. They talk about her mother's disability, her mental health. It's all very, yo mama's so crazy, whenever she goes running, she takes the psychopath. And I would like to thank Erin from 8th grade for telling me that joke however many years ago.
Yeah, that's quite a good one.
So Antoinette is getting seriously mean-girled, and I kind of wonder if this is a little bit of a Jane Eyre reference when Jane is young and living with her horrible relatives, the Reeds, and like those terrible cousins like always tormenting her. And they talk about the cousins being like sort of popular girl types. But thankfully Antoinette here is rescued by another bigger black boy named Sandy, who is actually her cousin. But she's not allowed to talk about that anymore because Mr. Mason, her stepfather, told her English people don't acknowledge that they rape their enslaved people, and sometimes that produces children. It just isn't dignified. So, yeah.
Second Jane Claxon, Sandy is St. John.
Jane.
We've got the first Jane Eyre Claxon of the other kids being the Reeds. Now we've got the rescuing cousin is St. John. It's St. John, baby.
I tentatively buy that the rescuing cousin who maybe you kind of have a thing with.
Will they, won't they? Yeah.
Will they, won't they? Yeah.
So, Antoinette makes it to the convent and everything there is actually alright.
Sorry, that is not my experience of nuns, Daniel. I think you've been reading this book upside down again.
So, we're meant to compare this episode in the convent with Jane Eyre's time at Lowood.
Jane Claxon!
Yes, please.
Jane.
Everything's hot instead of cold. The religious officials are really nice and give the girls plenty to eat, and even hairstyling advice, which obviously old Mr. Brocklebank or whatever his name is.
Brocklehurst!
Right. Brocklebank is also a name, isn't it?
I mean, technically, he did give hairstyling advice, and that was to shave the students who he thought had hair that was too nice.
There we go. That's it. They learn a lot of sort of self-indulgent vanity stuff, like embroidering roses, rather than equally useless puritanical bullshit.
So Catholicism wins again.
Well, are they Catholic? I thought they were Anglican nuns. But still, as we've discussed...
You guys have nuns?
You better believe it. You never seen Call the Midwife?
What? No, I've never... No?
Yeah, why would you have? Yeah, she's having a nice time at the convent, but at home, things aren't great. You having trouble at home? You know, they're those nice teachers, aren't they, that say that. Her mother doesn't seem to be getting any better. Christophine has moved away to live with her son. Mr. Mason, you know, her white pappy, keeps taking longer and longer business trips. And even Antoinette's aunt, who she's been living with, has decided to go back to England for her health.
Who goes to England for the climate? In fact, I'm going to stop there. I went to England for the climate from Scotland, and I went to Scotland from Vermont, so fair enough. But if you're in the Caribbean, friend... But yeah, man, this family really clocked out after their shift, didn't they? So Antoinette is actually having a great time with the nuns, said no one ever, apart from this book. Things are really stable.
Maybe, what's his face? Casanova.
Different kind of good time. Although maybe not. Yeah, let's queer reading this. Yep, we know what happens at convent school. We know what happens. So things are really stable. The people are kind there. Eventually, though, Mr. Mason talks about taking Antoinette out of the convent for reasons. And she's like, no, I'm good here. I want to stay hidden here my whole life. But it's kind of clear that Mr. Mason has other plans for her, and that makes her really uneasy. So this is the point in the novel where her life could sort of go in two directions, right? But unfortunately, Mr. Mason really chooses the wrong direction. So everything that follows, including all of Jane Eyre, I think is actually kind of a Back to the Future to Biff Tannen timeline. Then we find out, horror of horrors, her mother has actually been dead for a full year, and we don't know how, and she was never informed.
It's like Lolita as well. Mr. Mason and Antoinette in a car. I know you're paraphrasing about how Antoinette had a good time at the convent, but it is a bit more ambiguous than that. But I think that this reflects more maybe on Antoinette's own weirdness. But I'll just read this quote. Mm-hmm. Everything was brightness or dark. The walls, the blazing colours of the flowers in the garden, the nuns' habits were bright, but their veils, the crucifix hanging from their waists, the shadow of the trees were black. That was how it was, light and dark, sun and shadow, heaven and hell. For one of the nuns knew all about hell, and who does not? but another one knew about heaven and the attributes of the blessed. I could hardly wait for all this ecstasy, and once I prayed for a long time to be dead. So that's a really weird passage, isn't it? But I think maybe, however nice or not nice the convent is, I think we're also just getting an insight more into Antoinette's weird sort of schizophrenic worldview.
But this makes a lot of sense to me. In she is somebody who is ambiguous in a world that exists in black and white, and is she black and is she white, and we don't really know. And so she sees it everywhere, this sort of light and shadow. She talks about even like on the brightest day the sky looked black, and that's that sort of like ambiguity to her is almost death, or death would be easier.
Yeah. Oh, well, and also like both postcolonialism and feminism are about binaries and how we can overcome them. I suppose in that sense the style is reflecting those. Yeah. Part 2. And, listener, we've switched narrators. He's never named, but this is Mr. Rochester. You know him. You love him. He likes people with pillory necks. Well, prepare not to love him. Quote, so it was all over, the advance and retreat. The doubts and hesitations, everything finished for better or for worse. There we were, sheltering from the heavy rain under a large mango tree. Myself, my wife Antoinette, and a little half-caste servant who was called Mle.
So yeah, just remember Amelie from this opening scene, because she's going to be important later.
But the point is that Rochester here he's saying that he's just got married, isn't he?
Yeah, and he even says the words for better or for worse, and then there are 3 people in the scene, so let's just think about that.
But also he's speaking in this very oblique way about the fact that the marriage has happened, and in a very sort of like RC sort of way, right?
But I mean, basically part 2 opens up where The Graduate ends, so everyone's in wedding clothes and they're sort of staring into the middle distance, and Simon and Garfunkel is playing. Yeah. This was years later. Antoinette has, she's just married this dude. They're caught in a rainstorm on their honeymoon in a place called Massacre.
Nice.
Foreshadowing horn, maybe, I guess?
Yeah, why not?
And
there's also a backshadowing.
Backshadowing? God, what klaxon could be used for that?
It would be the same, but reversed.
Can we just use...
Like
So this male narrator, again, Mr. Rochester, but he is never named as such.
Antoinette is ambiguously... We don't know her name for a while, do we? Either,
yeah,
so.
But I don't think he's ever named.
No.
But he's not exactly smitten with his new wife. Everything she does seems to piss him off, or at the very least make him kind of suspicious. To the level that she doesn't even blink enough for his liking. He basically goes, listen, I'm experiencing a negative emotion, and now I'm about to make it your problem.
Mm-hmm. Also, let's have the bit here. I like the bit about Massacre. Rochester. And who was massacred here? Slaves? Oh no. Antoinette sounded shocked. Not slaves. Something must have happened a long time ago. Nobody remembers now. So, this, I don't know what's going on here. I feel like Antoinette could just be like whitewashing history in a very literal sense of the term and being like, oh no, we would never do anything like that. But also there's that kind of amnesia that we just had, because the Caribbean is that sort of, you've got the English regime, then you've got the French regime, then you've got the Spanish, then you've got the Arawaks or whoever, there's all these kind of successive things that people might have forgotten. It's like a palimpsest, you know what I mean? I feel like that's what's going on.
I love that term as a sort of literary term, palimpsestic or palimpsest, which is sort of when it originally meant when you're like people were writing manuscripts on vellum and you could sort of scrape it clean, but occasionally you could see the words underneath that had been written before and you write over them. Yeah. But it's this idea of like things being built over things that are still kind of visible.
Yeah. And vestigial.
Yeah, and that's a great literary term.
I think that's what's going on with Massacre, though.
Now, meanwhile, in a Werner Herzog movie...
Rochester. He's bitching about everything. He is a bit like Werner Herzog, isn't he? I'll read it like Herzog.
Oh, please do.
Everything is too much. I felt as I rode wearily after her. Too much blue. Too much purple. Too much green. The flowers too red. The mountains too high, the hills too near, and the woman is a stranger.
My prefab here is a ruddy Englishman getting angrier and angrier. He's a steamed ham.
As we suspected, or knew from Jane Eyre, their marriage has been arranged, and Antoinette has brought a dowry of, wait for it, £30,000. Let's measure and worth that.
Yes.
We all love it.
Do we?
Yeah.
Do we? Because there are some critics on Twitter.
You just said yes.
I mean, I love it.
If you want to compare the value of £30,000 in 1840, that's what year I'm assuming it is,
Okay.
there are 4 choices. The real wage, that's inflation. We all love it, don't we? It's all having fun these days. £2,882,000. That's a lot of money, isn't it, already? And we're, long-time listeners of the show will know we're still in the foothills of the Himalayas. The labour earnings of that income are well, so kind of in relation to the average wage, £28,100,000.
Golly.
Yeah, thank you. Relative income value of that, £38,040,000. And finally, here's the big one. You will love it. Everyone's always cheering for this one. The relative output value of that income or wealth. It is, and this is as a kind of, in terms of the clout within the economy, equivalent to £128,300,000. This is a lot of money.
Daniel, I love it when you do a measuring worth. There's something about you that goes kind of feral, like somebody has watered a gremlin after midnight.
I don't know, it's like a chance for me to really let loose.
And listen, detractors, you need to celebrate this. Daniel doesn't let his hair down very often. Let him have this one.
Yeah.
As sad and lame as it may be.
I think it's a useful device. Nonetheless, Rochester is having a hard time figuring out how he's supposed to feel about all of this. He's glad because he'll never be dependent on his father or older brother. He'll live well. His wife is beautiful. But has he sold his soul? Poor blokes. These poor blokes.
Oh, poor Diddums. He's like, well, I was raised by a sentient pile of money. I suppose now I get to have sex with a sentient pile of money. So, same diff.
Yeah. Ooh, a kind of Oedipal market reading. Interesting. Get that. the klaxoning for that.
Thank you very much, Sigmund Freud.
Rochester bitches a lot about colour, doesn't he? And then obviously Antoinette has this very kaleidoscopic sort of perspective.
And
so
she's like not necessarily a person of color, but she's kind of perceived as that by Rochester, and he's like, color equals bad.
and also she's not necessarily like pro the sort of weird colours that she describes either, but she's more kind of willing to engage, whereas Rochester's kind of like, there's too much colours. There's too many, not just in a racial sense, but just in a kind of like, oh, it's all too vibrant.
There's a part of me that slightly doesn't buy this, because in Jane Eyre, Rochester is constantly being described in Orientalist terms. He's always being described.
Yeah, East Indies, not the West Indies.
Yeah, and so I don't know if this is something like he's matured in Jane Eyre, which might be a valid reading. This might be him in his sort of really shitty younger years, where he's like maybe come to terms with it later in Jane Eyre. But he's got a super post-colonial Orientalist reading in the original Bronte, and that's kind of intriguing given how much he...
But isn't that the point, though, that he's been touched by it? He's been corrupted.
Oh, I mean, yeah,
so to speak.
But Jane finds it really attractive,
Yeah.
so it's like corrupted, but in not a bad way.
Yeah.
We also find out that Mr. Mason Sr., Antoinette's stepfather, the white pappy, he's died.
Oh, no.
And that leaves her stepbrother, Richard Mason, in charge. So we go into a flashback now of Rochester's courtship of Antoinette. And he remembers how hollowly he performed, because, he sort of had to. He had to, make the overtures to this young woman who he had to marry. And none of the white people who were in attendance doubted his performance. They're like, oh, what a wonderful young lover. Because white people's capacity for denial is endless. But he just knows in his heart that all of the black people who were sort of serving them, they knew. They saw how unimpressed he was, how dead inside he was. So great. I look forward to seeing this dude fail upward for the rest of his life.
That's the dream. The whole white people not doubting him and black people knowing, that's also like a fetishizing thing, isn't it? Saying like, oh, that they've got their wisdom, they see, so that's kind of bollocks as well. I bet there's plenty of white people that knew that he was making an effort for starters. Well, anyway, cut back to the honeymoon. That was a flashback. So he's had a bit of a culture shock, Rochester has, hasn't he? But things start going a bit better for him now they're there. He first realises how attractive his wife is. He rescues a moth from the house and they go for a romantic walk. Antoinette tells him a weird story about rats. Always a sign of, a budding romance. And they sing a little song. I can't remember what it's about. It's not about rats.
I mean, this is very, like, awkward first date vibes. I've been on worse.
The moth thing is one of, moths to a flame.
Mm-hmm.
That's like a fatal attraction type
Yeah.
metaphor, isn't it? So I think there's a bit of that going on.
And he's the pale one. He's not a butterfly to the flame, is he? He's the sort of grey.
Right, yeah. Miserable English moth.
Pasty.
Also, Christophene's back on the scene.
Oh, good. Oh, thank God.
So, and Rochester, he's intimidated by her. Who isn't? I ask.
So the next day, presumably like the day after their wedding night, it actually goes really well. They end up having a kind of sexy bath together in a big pool outside the house. They watch some animals, and Antoinette apparently throws rocks charmingly, like a boy. Is that a queer reading? I don't know.
Maybe,
Why not?
yeah.
Sure. And she says her cousin Sandy taught her how to do it, but she leaves out the fact that he's a black cousin. She conveniently, misses out that detail. The husband, Mr. Rochester, doesn't like how much she trusts her black servants, especially Christophine. So one of the reasons he doesn't really like his new wife, Antoinette, is that she's clearly gauche enough to fall in love with her husband. In fairness, Antoinette is very intense, and she often talks about death late at night.
Oh, God.
She says, quote, "If I could die now, when I am happy, would you do that? You wouldn't have to kill me. Say die and I will die. You don't believe me? Then try, say die and watch me die." And Rochester says, "Die then, die," and continues, "I watched her die many times."
La petite mort.
We're getting all sexy with it. Okay, all right. Apparently, Rochester knows his way around a lady's pants. And they decide to stay at this honeymoon house in Massacre, and they ambivalently fuck for weeks, and the whole thing is very 50 Shades of White.
Yeah. Then, one day, an urgent letter is delivered to Rochester by a local man named Daniel Cosway. That's my name, isn't it? Well, some of it.
Oh, I bet he'll be a really nice guy, just like...
don't say that. It says that the Antoinette's family is loathed in the area for being disgusting slave owners.
Fair.
If Rochester cares about that. Well, I think he kind of does, doesn't he? I don't know.
I don't know that he really gives a shit.
But he does differentiate himself from the Creoles, partly in the terms of slavery.
I think he differentiates himself from them in racist terms.
But also in hypocritically anti-racist terms.
Well, yeah. He's like, well, I'm not a slave owner. I was like, no, you just think you haven't been tainted by blackness.
Yeah,
Really.
he's benefited from it at home.
Yeah, exactly.
What you sprinkling on your cornflakes, dickhead? So, Cosway continues, "There is madness in the family, so you better watch out, boy." The writer reveals that he's Antoinette's half-brother. Her father presumably raped one of his slaves or had a relationship with a black woman nearby, and he was the result. And I like this bit because the letter's written in patois, so we get a bit of kind of, different dialects going on in the text, which is part of its appeal, I think.
Yeah, it is. Although I do think this is one of the few occasions where the email should have been a meeting.
Yes, yeah.
So Rochester, he's reading this letter, and to be honest, he isn't really that surprised. He says, he kind of recounts this like he was expecting it, and this isn't helped when he sort of stumbles back into their bedroom, and he hears Mlle, the servant, goading Antoinette, and Amelie's being really cruel to her. She's like, "Oh, your husband, he always comes out of his room looking like a zombie. Like, what do you do to sex the life out of him? I bet he's already sick of you." And Antoinette slaps Mlle, who then calls her a white cockroach and slaps her back.
Can't get the staff, can you, these days? So I'm thinking, sack that woman.
So then Mlle, the servant, starts flirting with Rochester and giving him all her bedroom eyes, and I'm just like, ugh, why? Would this count as getting lucky for either of them? And the prefab I have here is, if Mlle lived today, she would absolutely smell like an $8 body spray called something like Grape Tongue Kiss. She's a tramp.
So, Rochester goes out for a melodramatic walk, we've all done them, haven't we, in the rain, and he nearly gets lost, while lamenting, however, and clearly knows about his wife's madness, which he just kind of blindly accepts now he's read Daniel Cosway's letter. He thinks everyone's tricked him, that he's a laughing stock.
Oh my god, Rochester, quit bugging out.
He just decides to stop eating and start drinking heavily. This was a good idea. While reading about zombies. and trying to figure out if he is one.
No. Sorry. This is how Dateline episodes start. No thank you. I'm not
I
having
was
it.
thinking more like late night Googling, like, am I a zombie? And then like, WebMD is like, yes.
So now we switch back to Antoinette as a narrator, and it's I found this bit very confusing because oftentimes when they switch narrators, it's not entirely clear who is speaking, so sometimes you're like, wait, is this Rochester or is this Antoinette? So Antoinette goes to Christophene's house, and Christophene tells Antoinette, she's like, listen, I'm gonna give you some advice about men, but the more you love a man, the more he loathes you. If you're not that fussed, the man will be after you day and night, so just like, get rid of this bozo, who cares? But Antoinette's like, I can't leave him. Legally, he owns all my money and property. And Christophene's like, yeah, English law is a real bitch. That really sucks, man. I'm sorry, you never should have married this guy.
Antoinette still thinks everything can be saved, especially if she goes to England with her husband.
Yeah, England, that bastion of stability.
Wouldn't it be great to see a swan and some snow and Chelmsford? This is your joke. This is Abby's joke. It's a good one, though.
That's not my joke. Those are literal things she says in the book.
So, if Christophene could just work a bit of her folk magic and make Rochester fancy sleeping with Antoinette, she could make him love her. Christophene's like,
That's quite the Hail Mary.
yeah. She's just like, yeah, maybe I could do a spell on him to sleep with you. That would just make him hate you all the more afterwards.
So Antoinette reveals to Christophene that Rochester has kind of been sniffing around her past, and he found out that her mother's name is also Antoinette. And Rochester's a bit like, not on my fucking watch, your name is now Bertha. And she's like, listen, I'm just going to reason with him, and I'm going to act as not crazy as I possibly can. I'm going to explain very calmly what happened to my mother, her horrible trauma. Rochester's bound to listen to reason, says the most hopeful woman in the world.
Yeah, she is mad, isn't she? That's what I'm thinking. So, we cut back to Rochester. He's got another goading letter from the good Daniel Cosway, noted shit stirrer.
So, this week on Daddy Issues, Rochester, he's like, okay, I'm gonna go visit this Daniel Cosway dude who may or may not be my wife's illegitimate half-brother. And Daniel Cosway instantly launches into his own problems with his father. And Rochester's like, you know what, bad fathers, that's something I can get on board with. And Daniel Cosway also starts on Christophene, saying she's a liar, and you know what, she's been to jail. And Daniel Cosway confirms that Antoinette and her black cousin Sandy, they might have had a little thing going on back in the day. Maybe they still do.
He was on a different island, though. How are they doing that?
No, once you go Sandy, you'll always be Randy.
Very good.
Daniel Cosway is like, listen, buddy, for the low price of £500.
Start measuring worth.
Do you actually have it?
No, I didn't do it.
Daniel! Damn it! Another Daniel to disappoint me in this episode. Great. He's like, for the low price of £500, I'll keep my mouth shut about everything I know. And Rochester's like, no, this is all getting a little intense for me. I've had sex with this woman. I can't fathom that she could ever be attracted to a black man. And he flees, and Daniel Cosway sort of shouts at him, you'll rue the day.
This is the birth of the oversexed legend about Bertha, isn't it? I feel like we needed a Jane Claxon in there.
Oh, yeah. Rochester comes home, and Antoinette tries to reason with him. And she's like, listen, I know this guy, Daniel Cosway. He actually hates all white people. And he has been peddling this story for years.
The guy's a racist.
Daniel!
An upward racist.
So Antoinette manages to hold her together really, really well. The second Rochester manages to wring the tiniest bit of emotion out of her, he then starts calling her shrill?
He's a wanker, isn't he? She pushes back against being called Bertha, but he's like, you're Bertha from now on, love. She's like, Christophene has told me to leave you. And he's like, yeah, maybe we should separate. And then he thinks, actually, I'm quite attracted to you, and they end up having sex. Did Christophene give him the sex spell?
Or is he just that guy who's like, well... So Rochester wakes up and he feels really suffocated. He just had sex with his lawfully wedded wife. And he has to go away to vomit. I did not know sex could be so bad. So she's a freak in the streets and a freak in a bad way in the sheets, apparently, and he just has to go puke it out. And then he watches her sleep for a while, which is a normal thing to do. And then he decides, you know what? I loathe this woman, and I'm going to sneak out before she wakes. So he goes back to his own room, which is right next door, and he has Mlle bring him some breakfast chicken and some breakfast wine.
That starts the day well.
As you do. And they start a giggling, and they start a wrestling, and before you know it, sex. And this is all despite his wife being asleep in just the next room. Just, man, this is really risky. You're only separated by a wall. It's like, you know how, like, when you piss through your neighbor's letterbox? Mm. You gotta be quick.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Yeah. I've got my prefab here. Rochester has a bit of post-coitum homo racist. Because he says a few racist things about Mlle after they have sex, doesn't he? Like, after the fact, he's a bit like, ooh. Mlle then tells him that she's leaving, that she's going to go hunting for rich husbands in Rio.
This makes me like her so much more.
Rochester's like, thanks for the tumble, darling. Good luck with that. I wish you well. So that's nice. Christophine has also said that she's going to be leaving, and now the cook says that she's leaving too. Things
Everyone's like, this fucking house. We're done. We're
the
done.
centre ain't holding.
Yeah.
Even Antoinette goes out that day by horse and stays away a long time. And when she comes back, she barricades herself in a bedroom.
Do you think, did she hear her husband boinking her mortal enemy from one room away? So finally, when Rochester manages to see Antoinette next, he was, quote, too shocked to speak because she looks awful. She's described here kind of in the way she's described in Jane Eyre.
Jane!
Quote, her hair hung uncombed and dull into her eyes, which were inflamed and staring. Her face was very flushed and looked swollen. Her feet were bare. However, when she spoke, her voice was low, almost inaudible. So she's like a wreck of herself. She's had a really bad day.
It comes out that Rochester has fallen out of love with her. Was he ever in love with her? Who knows? He's not in it anyway. And Antoinette, she's rather pissed on the old rum. She bites his arm till it bleeds.
Ooh, Jane Eyre reference.
Jane!
Then she breaks a rum decanter and starts menacing him with the broken end, like she's in a sort of Glaswegian bar brawl. Christophine shows up and manages to stop the fight. She's like, why don't you just take Antoinette's money, take Mlle, and why don't the two of you f*** off? All you care about is money. Christophine, she reads him the riot act about how he's been treating Antoinette. We get into a sort of very odd stylistic thing where in parentheses and italics he starts repeating in his head every phrase that Christophine says to him. It's, you know, like a weird echo. It's quite a weird bit.
So Christophine also reveals that she's been giving Antoinette some like drug to help her sleep, but it's been sort of turning Antoinette into a zombie, and she's been having a harder and harder time waking up. So Christophine's like, you know what, I'm just gonna start giving her a ton of rum instead. I'm not thrilled by this Judy Garland cocktail. Mm-hmm. Rochester's like, all you've done is turn Antoinette into a wreck of herself, and Christophine's like, F*** you, buddy, you've done that. And they really tear into each other. And Christophine, she's just like, you know what? You better watch your 6, white devil.
Yeah, it's a good bit, isn't it? Also, Christophine goes on a lot of weird tangents about doctors and people called Rupert. So, I don't know, it's kind of like half modernism, half kind of rambly old lady. Also, in the parentheses bits, the kind of Rochester thought stuff, he does a lot of wordplay too, doesn't he? He does that kind of marionette, Antoinette, marionetta, Antoinetta stuff. So there's a kind of modernism shining through there, I think. Next. Christophine's like, either love her and treat her well, or get gone. If you're a gentleman, you return half of her dowry. But you can even keep half of it and go to England. I'll take care of her. We'll go travelling. You know, maybe get a dog or something. Maybe she'll get married again to someone who appreciates her.
Your marriage is over. The first wife is just for practice, like the first pancake.
Yes. This gives Rochester a pang of jealousy.
So maybe he does like her after all. We don't know.
We're just like owning things. So he kicks Christophine out and he says, I'll call the police if you don't leave.
So Rochester, he's like, okay, look, I'm just going to take my maybe crazy wife that I've just decided it's crazy, cuz we're going to move to Jamaica. We're going to move off our delightful honeymoon
She
island.
didn't go of her own accord.
Say again?
She didn't go of her own accord. You know the joke. My wife went to the Caribbean. Jamaica? No, she went of her own accord. Antoinette did not go of her own accord. Next.
It was a reach, Daniel.
Oh, yeah, that's a good joke.
Should you take a lateral flow test if you don't have any taste? So, Rochester is like, let's move back to Jamaica. I'm going to take Antoinette. Maybe we need to go see some doctors because she clearly must be crazy because one crazy man who wrote me said she was. And he gets really drunk. He starts drinking a lot. And then he starts doodling a house. A big English manor house with a woman on the 3rd floor. Jane Eyre-fan.
Jane.
On the trip to Jamaica, Rochester almost seems to kind of lose it. Kind of very ambiguous who's speaking, him or Antoinette. We get these kind of cryptic non sequiturs about how much she hates him. He's even really horrible to his servant, Baptiste, who's growing to love Rochester.
Oh, queer reading. 1,000% of queer reading.
Let's just talk about Baptiste's cool outfit, because I really like it. Baptiste's cool new look. Baptiste looked very different, not a trace of the polite domestic. He wore a very wide-brimmed straw hat, like the fisherman's hat, but the crown flat, not high and pointed. His wide leather belt was polished, so was the handle of his sheathed cutlass, and his blue cotton shirt and trousers were spotless. That's a cool look, isn't it? Baptiste has begged Antoinette to convince Rochester to take him with them, and Rochester's like, no, you're crap at English.
Rochester's such an f***ing ass.
You who waited on my every whim, I'm not bringing you to Jamaica. You know, and Baptiste goes off crying. I was tired of these people. I disliked their laughter and their tears, their flattery and envy, conceit and deceit, and I hated the place. I hated the mountains and the hills, the rivers and the rain. I hated the sunsets of whatever colour. I hated its beauty and its magic and the secret I would never know. I hated its indifference and the cruelty, which is part of its loveliness. Above all, I hated her, for she belonged to the magic and the loveliness. She left me thirsty, and all my life would be thirst and longing for what I had lost before I found it. So
now we enter part 3, and we open on a quotation with Grace Poole. If you remember her from Jane Eyre, she's charged to take care of Bertha Rochester.
So by one revisionist feminist parable, get another thrown in. We got Grace Poole. She's got a voice too now.
So she's talking about how she got this job working for Rochester and how he's like, I'll pay double, triple to have somebody take care of my new wife, Bertha, so I just never have to think about her again. And he's kind of gone off to someplace, quote, foreign. So in the Jane Eyre timeline, this is the period where I assume he's gone to France and has a love child, Adele, that is the reason Jane ends up coming to Thornfield Hall in the first place.
We go back to Antoinette's narration. Now she's imprisoned in England. So she's been planning on begging Rochester for her freedom in exchange for never seeing him again. But she hasn't been able to ask. She hasn't seen Rochester since they arrived in England, in the dark and cold of England.
Wait, I'm sorry, is her husband a deadbeat dad?
Yeah, looks like it. She's also become morbidly fascinated by fire.
Oh, good combo.
Yeah. She's also tried some gin from Grace Poole's flask once Grace drank herself to sleep. So, you know, she used to drink rum like it was water, but just one slug of gin is enough to knock her out.
Well, Daniel, you can't just knock back straight gin. I mean, it's not rum. It's not a breakfast liquor.
Exactly, yeah.
Antoinette, also, she starts casually stealing Grace's keys, and she wanders around the house at this time. And she's really confused about where she is, and she's like, this can't possibly be the beautiful England I was dreaming of. I'm not in England. She thinks the ship must have taken them to some other country across this wide Sargasso Sea. So she's like, listen, Control F, but for England. I know it must be around here somewhere. And then one morning, Antoinette wakes up with all these red marks on her wrist, and she's like, I don't remember what happened. And apparently, like, years have passed, and we're now in the Jane Eyre timeline, and this is the night that she stabbed and bit her stepbrother Richard, and she's completely blacked this out.
Ooh. So she hallucinates her cousin Sandy coming to see her one last time. Tell me about it, stud. She and Sandy then have a passionate dream kiss, and she says, quote, now there was no time left, so we kissed each other in that stupid room. We had often kissed before, but not like that. That was the life and death kiss. So what's going on with Sandy? Was there something romantic? Why don't we see any of that?
Yeah.
I mean, he's hardly in it at all, isn't he?
Do you know why I like this book?
Go on.
They really get the incest right. I'm sorry, that's not my joke. That's a community joke.
Right.
Then she has a, quote, dream again. And this is the scene where she burns down Thornfield after Jane has left. So we don't get... I think this is really interesting. We don't get any of the more famous scenes from Jane Eyre. Jane is really absent from this retelling. We don't get her tearing Jane's wedding veil, or the scene when Jane and Rochester visit after their sort of abortive wedding. And Antoinette has this complete out-of-body experience where she steals Grace's keys. She grabs a candle, and she hears laughter and screaming, and she worries it's, quote, the ghost of the woman who haunts this place.
Bit of dissociation.
This is really fascinating. So she sees herself in a mirror, and in sort of shock and recognition, she drops the candle she's holding, and some drapes go up in flame. And she calls on the spirit of Christophine to help her. She goes upstairs toward the roof, and she hallucinates things from her Caribbean home along the way. I'm just like, hurry up. If you're going to kill Rochester, just, like, do it before he dies of old age. Arson murder his ass.
So she hallucinates her mother's parrot. This is their big goodbye, isn't it? Who says in French, "Who's there, qui est là?" She thinks she hears the man who hates her screaming Bertha. She also thinks she hears her friend Tia. She screams Tia and jumps.
Ooh. And then, meanwhile, still today...
Then she wakes up in her room with Grace Poole, who also heard the scream and wonders what it was. Grace Poole checks out the noise, can't figure it out, falls into another drunken stupor. Antoinette takes the keys and says, quote, "I was outside holding my candle. Now at last I know why I was brought here and what I had to do. There must have been a draught, for the flame flickered and I thought it was out, but I shielded it with my hand and it burned up again to light me along the dark passage."
Ooh. So in short, she's hit rock bottom and has decided to just keep drilling.
Yeah, do the old, Samson. Happy ending.
I like that she always has to get by Grace Poole. Like, Grace Poole is a mini-boss blocking the final boss, but all you have to do is just wait 6.5 minutes and she'll fall asleep.
Yeah, that's always... Who else in our reading list could do with a prequel from the back catalogue? I thought, I'm just going to say mine, Grendel's mother. It's a bit of an obvious choice, but I thought Grendel's mother could do with a book. Tituba. She's not really a villain, is she? But she's kind of, it would be interesting to know about her. A bit depressing, probably. She was a real woman as well, wasn't she? Tituba from, what's it called?
The Crucible.
The Crucible. And, of course, I mean, I've already written this, but Catherine de Bourgh.
I was sort of thinking, actually, Mrs. Bennet from Pride and Prejudice, that would explain a lot of her.
Good.
Obviously, I'm always going to go for Gulliver's Wife and Gulliver's Travels.
Yes, yeah, that would be really good, yeah.
Would you like... Are you sure you want some casting?
Yes, please.
Because I've really, really gone off the rails with this one.
Okay.
The issue is, there have been a million adaptations of Jane Eyre. There have been so many other similar stories about a woman imprisoned by a marriage in the 19th century, and it's been done to gritty death, and I'm kind of sick of it.
Okay.
So,
Sci-fi.
I think you're not gonna like this. I want this set in the present day, and I want it done in the style of Fleabag.
Oh yeah.
I think even the overt commentary on imperialism could really, really work in this style, because if you think about things like Broad City, they do a lot comedically with sort of white women very imperfectly facing their privilege. And I just think there could be a lot there to sort of unpack if we do it from a comedy angle.
I'm not opposed to this.
You hate this idea.
No, I don't.
Yes, you do.
All right. Like Antoinette, I'm being told what to think.
Right, and now for our segment, Bad Goodreads Reviews. Mr. Rochester will never be anywhere in the same league as Mr. Darcy. 1 star. Why are you comparing these two men? First of all, Austen was writing way before the Brontes. Secondly, this book isn't even a Bronte book. This is a rewriting of an especially dirtbag Rochester. Friend, you're killing me. Okay. No idea how this could possibly be considered a literary masterpiece. Some of the text doesn't even make sense. 1 star. Yes, that's because you've discovered modernism. And then the best one is, the term literature masterpiece has been used to describe this book. Well, it's 130 pages, so I think it's a novella at best, so first error there. 1 star! So apparently size does matter. Alright, that's it.
As per, we had kind of quite different styles of reading. Mine was very sort of perfunctory and like feminism, postcolonialism, and yours was more quite granular. So I don't know if we should start with the granular readings or the general readings.
We can do whatever you like, friend.
Yeah, let's talk about the title first, because you were asking about the Sargasso Sea. So why is it called that? Why is it called the Wide Sargasso Sea? It's the bit around the Bermuda Triangle.
Yeah, so I thought this was really interesting because the Sargasso Sea, it's not only around the Bermuda Triangle, which is like a place of loss and confusion and suspicion and all that stuff, but it's the only sea in the world, as far as I'm aware, that has absolutely no land boundary. So it's a sea surrounded by other seas and oceans and things like that. There's nothing to orient you, and I think that really reflects
that kind of deracinated feeling.
Yeah.
Well, this is the thing that I knew about it, that it's full of seaweed.
It's simultaneously this incredibly beautiful blue clear water, but then there are patches of it that are really, really covered in seaweed. So there's that, like, is this incredibly clear, or is it incredibly, like, obfuscated and mysterious?
Also that sense of, like, very vivid colour, but then also overgrowth. I was thinking it's also just the bit in between the Caribbean and Europe, isn't it? In broad terms.
Well, yeah,
that's pretty lazy reading on my part.
No, but that's an important reading of, like, literally, it's between the Caribbean and England, isn't it? It's how you get there. It's the one thing
and
to the
It's
other.
about the breadth between their two cultures.
Yeah, so this was also probably not what Rhys intended in the 1960s, but also keep in mind that the Sargasso Sea is the area that has the North Atlantic garbage patch, and I kind of thought, well, doesn't Rochester belong there perfectly?
Yeah, he is that, isn't he? Yeah.
But also the idea that the Sargasso Sea is considered a very, like, calm bit of sea, which you think is a safe thing, but in terms of shipping, a calm sea is very, very dangerous.
Yeah, the doldrums.
Yeah, that's how you get stuck. So the idea of, like, oh, stability is good, you know, what I'm used to is good, but it's actually, no, you get stuck there and you're gonna die there.
Yeah. Jane Eyre as a kind of prequel then, you know, where there's a lot of, like, deliberate allusions to it, aren't there?
Is this fan fiction?
Maybe, yeah.
Like, and can this stand on its own? And I gotta be honest, I don't think this can stand on its own. I think it's a very, very good novel, but I think it's built on too much of the structure of Jane Eyre, where I don't think it doesn't have the same resonance if it's not deconstructing something. So I think it is fan fiction.
I think it can.
It's so enriched by Jane Eyre. It's so pointing a finger at European literature, Western culture, literature. Like,
well, that's
a weird thing. It needs it to undo it.
But that's the contradiction of all this stuff, isn't it? That this is a world that has been produced by the metropole in part, but it's also as Rochester and Antoinette found out, it's very different and very autonomous from the metropole in itself, even just culturally.
It gains its own life as it goes on.
And
that's cool.
That's you don't need to know about Europe to know about the Caribbean, and you don't need to know about Jane Eyre to know about Wide Sargasso Sea. But no doubt there are aspects of Caribbean culture that would be you would have a certain appraisal of if you knew about European culture, for example.
Yeah.
You know, I feel like that's the case with all culture, isn't it? No doubt, you know, you and I would be much better literary scholars if we both could read Latin, but I mean, I can't. It's the same sort of thing, though, isn't it? I just thought that, though, because so much of this book just in itself is about what you're describing, isn't it? There's so much stuff about not just like mental illness and different like categories of thought, which obviously informs the style of writing, but also there's a lot about myth and different kind of cultural vernaculars. You know, like ideas of flamboyance and colours and stuff. You know, like there's a kind of stylistic, folkloric, psychological and textual variety that runs throughout the text that I think confirms what you're saying about this spirit of variety or whatever, or confusion. Let's briefly discuss postcolonialism. I just think there's this cool bit in where Christophene says England. You think there's such a place? So Christophene sort of upends colonial relationships, but she also kind of reinforced them. So she's also
Tom Stopparding going, England, it's just a conspiracy of cartographers.
Exactly, yeah. What's that?
It's from Rosencrantz and Guildenstern are Dead.
There you go. Yeah. Doesn't this book precede that?
Yes, so yeah,
Okay.
by a
But
long
yeah, it
margin.
is like that. But I suppose here we've got this whole Caribbean thing that she's kind of denying the metropole, so there's that kind of additional post-colonial component, maybe, I don't know, rather than a kind of whimsical thought experiment, I don't know. There's a lot of stuff like about the profundity of our blackness, so there's a kind of reverse pigmentocracy thing going on there, isn't there? Should we briefly talk about feminism in conjunction with Jane Eyre? So, how does Wide Sargasso Sea commentate upon, continue, or critique the ideas of gender that are explored in Jane Eyre?
Well, these are both very clearly feminist novels, but it's interesting that Antoinette is sort of forced into a very passive role, and Jane is the very passionate, angry woman.
She's a ball buster. An orchidoclast, as well, yeah, I was just thinking that in terms of periodization, though, like, so, because Jane Eyre, as you say, is this kind of like...
Jane Eyre's incredibly radical for the time it's in, where Jane is so angry. You don't get that in the 1840s much.
It's a kind of about... It's a sort of... I don't want to be too harsh on it, because I do like it, but back to fanfic, it's almost like a Mary Sue thing, isn't it? That she kind of... Imagine if there was a woman that could just somehow, like, rise to power and become queen of the castle. That would be great, wouldn't it? And in itself, that's a radical thing to do. But this is telling a very different story, isn't it? It's saying, like, no... that would have been very hard to do, and a man would have exerted that kind of power, like, would have exerted power over a woman in a way that would have prevented her from doing that. And we've got two kinds of narratives here, one about somebody just rising to power, and that's framed as like a kind of a triumph. One about somebody who's completely stymied, and that's framed as like a kind of historical inevitability, or maybe not inevitability, but like a kind of, she's casualty of the patriarchy, whereas Jane is a kind of overcomer of the patriarchy. And I wonder if those reflect different historical moments, the 1840s and the 1960s.
They might. I mean, can I ask you the question of which do you prefer? Which text?
This one's a lot shorter. I like both, but I do have a Victorian leaning.
A bit of advice. One of the things you should always pay attention to, if people talk a lot about flowers or plant life, you might think that's really inconsequential, but actually, especially in the Victorian era, there's a whole language of flowers and plants that it used to mean something. So if you like sent this flower to your beloved, that would communicate some sort of secret message. And people in the Victorian period would like absolutely integrate that into their storytelling, and that has carried on over the years. So just like if somebody talks about flowers or plant life, just look up what the meaning.
Orchids, balls. I've said it already. It's back.
All right, and our clue to the next episode. Now, you know how we do on this show. We're always doing queer readings. We're always encouraging characters to come out of the closet. But this time, we're going to be going into a closet. Well, maybe not exactly a closet.
Please tweet us at smfms_podcast or write to us at save me from my shelf. Not self, that's the joke, at gmail.com. Just do all that, rate, review, subscribe.
Right, so, alright, thank you guys. We will see you next time for our Christmas special, and have a good couple of weeks.
Peace out.
Ew!
Thanks for listening to Save Me From My Shelf. Our music is The Overture to Don Giovanni by Mozart, and cover art is by Catherine Wu. Our thanks to Aston University's Centre for Critical Inquiry into Society and Culture for funding the startup of this podcast. Contact us at savemefrommyshelf@gmail.com or at smfms_podcast on Twitter. And do not, I'm going to remind you, do not forget to rate, review, and subscribe. Do not forget. Thank you.